Michael J. Fox has spent 35 years proving a diagnosis wrong, and this script starts exactly where that fight actually began. He held up his hand, and it would not stay still. Not a tremor he could hide behind a joke, not something he could shake off with the charm that had carried him through 3 decades of fame. This was different. This was the hand of a man the world still pictured as 26 years old, forever caught mid-run across a parking lot, forever grinning through a decade that made him one of the most beloved faces in America. But grins fade. Bones break. And somewhere between the boy who once played a wisecracking teenager on primetime television and the man who now needs a walker just to cross a room, something shifted that nobody was ready to talk about. Here is the part people rarely say out loud. Michael J. Fox has spent 35 years proving a diagnosis wrong. Not the diagnosis itself, that part never changed. Parkinson's disease doesn't reverse, doesn't pause, and doesn't negotiate. What he proved wrong was the assumption that came with it. The assumption that a young man handed a devastating diagnosis at 29 would fade quietly into medical footnotes. Instead, he built an empire of research, wrote 5 books, returned to acting not once but twice, and stood on stages accepting honors most careers never come close to earning. But this isn't a story about triumph dressed up to look easy. It's not going to pretend the fall didn't happen, that the surgeries didn't nearly take his ability to walk, or that there wasn't a moment when even he ran out of the optimism people expected him to hand out like candy. Because that's the part of this story that actually matters. Not the highlight reel. The real one. So let's start where it actually started, not with the fame, not with the awards, not with the foundation that now moves billions of dollars into laboratories around the world. Let's start with a hand that would not stay still in a hotel room and a body that hadn't yet learned what it was about to carry for the rest of its life. Because to understand why people are once again asking whether things are looking good for Michael J. Fox, you have to understand what looking good ever really meant for him in the first place. It never meant easy. It never meant symptom-free. It meant something else entirely, something most people watching from the outside never quite figured out until it was already happening in front of them, cameras rolling, the world watching, and Fox smiling anyway, not because he was hiding anything anymore, but because he had simply decided, once again, to keep going. That decision is where this truly begins. The year was 1990. The place was Gainesville, Florida, a town that had nothing to do with Hollywood and everything to do with the film he was shooting at the time. He woke up that morning nursing a headache he didn't think twice about, the kind actors shrug off between takes. He lifted his hand to block the sun coming through the window, and something brushed against his cheek. His first thought was almost laughable in hindsight, a moth, maybe, some small annoyance he'd swat away without breaking stride. It wasn't a moth. It was his own pinky finger, moving on its own, independent of anything he told it to do. He has described that moment more than once, and every time, the language changes slightly, but the weight never does. It felt like his body had started sending signals from somewhere he couldn't reach. A message, he called it once, from the future. At 29 years old, with 3 Emmys already on a shelf somewhere in a film career most actors spend a lifetime chasing, the future was supposed to be the easy part. Instead, it arrived early, uninvited, and impossible to ignore. The diagnosis came the following year. Early onset Parkinson's disease. Words that, at the time, belonged to a different generation entirely, grandfathers, not new fathers. Fox was newly married to Tracy Pollan, the woman he'd fallen for on the set of the very show that made him famous. Their first son had just been born. He was standing at the exact intersection of everything going right, and the ground beneath that intersection had just quietly given way. Here's the contrast that made it unbearable. This wasn't a man whose career was fading, searching for relevance, looking for a story to hold on to. This was a man at full velocity. 7 seasons behind him. A trilogy that had already made him a household name across multiple generations. A wedding, a son, a life that looked, from every outside angle, like it was only getting started. And into that exact moment, his own nervous system delivered a verdict no script had prepared him for. What almost nobody knew, because he made sure of it, was that this was only the beginning of a private war he would wage silently, in plain sight, for the better part of a decade. The tremor didn't stop. It didn't fade. It became something he had to manage, hide, and choreograph around, take after take, scene after scene, while the world kept watching a face that gave away nothing. That silence is where the next part of this story lives. For 7 years, Michael J. Fox told no one outside his closest circle. Not the press, not most of his colleagues, not the millions of people who watched him every week without the faintest idea that the man on their screen was fighting a war beneath his skin. He kept working. He kept booking roles. He starred in films throughout the early 90s, and then, in 1996, he stepped back into television as Deputy Mayor Mike Flaherty on Spin City, a role that would go on to win him another Emmy, 3 more Golden Globes, and 2 Screen Actors Guild Awards. All of it was earned while carrying a diagnosis that was actively rewriting his nervous system in real time. Here's what made it possible, and what made it almost unbelievable in hindsight: he built an entire private operation just to appear normal. He timed his medication with the precision of a stage manager calling cues, calculating exactly when a pill needed to hit his system so that his hands would cooperate long enough to get through a scene. He kept his left hand busy between takes, training it into constant motion so the tremor had less room to reveal itself. Directors saw a hard-working, energetic actor. What they didn't see was the machinery running underneath, a system built entirely to protect a secret that was growing heavier by the year. Watch his work from that decade now, knowing what was happening off camera, and something shifted. But secrets like that don't stay contained forever. By the 3rd season of Spin City, the effort of holding it together had started to outweigh the relief of hiding it. Reporters were circling closer. And somewhere in that pressure, something else was happening, a shift not in his body, but in his willingness to keep carrying the weight alone. In 1998, he stopped. He spoke publicly. The secret that had defined 7 years of his life ended in a single announcement, and what followed surprised him more than the diagnosis itself ever had. He went online anonymously into Parkinson's forums, curious what strangers actually thought about this whole Michael J. Fox situation, bracing for pity. What he found instead was relief. Not because people wanted him to suffer, but because for years, an entire community living with this disease had existed largely unseen, and suddenly someone the world already loved had stepped into the light beside them. That reaction changed how he understood his own diagnosis. It stopped being only a personal loss. It became something else entirely, a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but one he was about to accept in full. The years that followed tested him in ways no amount of preparation could have softened. Parkinson's rarely announces itself as a single blow. It arrives in installments, and for Fox, one of the cruelest installments had nothing to do with tremors at all. In 2018, doctors found a tumor on his spine, benign, unrelated to Parkinson's, but carrying its own quiet threat of paralysis. He went through surgery, then months of physical therapy just to relearn something most people never think twice about: how to walk. He had barely rebuilt that ability when the universe delivered its next contradiction. Alone in his kitchen, doing nothing more dramatic than crossing the room, he tripped and broke his arm. What followed reads less like a medical history and more like a demolition list. A shoulder was replaced. An elbow broken. A hand fractured, then infected badly enough to threaten the hand itself. A shattered cheekbone. Damage to the bone around his eye. He would later describe all of it in 4 words that carried more honesty than any polished statement could: it sucked. This is the part of the story competitors love to linger on, framing it as an ending. But contrast is everything here, because what actually happened next wasn't retreat, it was something far more complicated and far more human. He broke, yes. Not just physically. Emotionally. After the tumor, after relearning to walk, after the fall that undid all of it in a single misstep, Fox reached a point where the relentless optimism people expected from him simply ran out. He said it himself, plainly, he was out of the lemonade business. That sentence deserves to sit for a moment, because it's the truest thing in this entire story. He wasn't glowing with wisdom every single day. He wasn't floating serenely above the pain. He was exhausted. He was in a place that felt familiar in the worst way, one he'd known decades earlier, except this time the old escape routes were closed. He'd been sober for over 30 years. There was no numbing this. There was only sitting inside it. What pulled him back wasn't a speech he gave himself. It was Tracy Pollan, still beside him after decades of marriage. It was 4 grown children who had never known their father any other way. His fear, he said more than once, was never really about his own mortality. It was about the possibility of leaving them exposed to something he couldn't control. That fear, that love, became the foundation of the documentary Still, released in 2023. He gave the filmmaker one instruction only: no violins. No manufactured sentiment. Just the truth, the falls, the pain, the humor, the stubbornness, all of it, unfiltered. Because if this story was going to be told at all, he wanted it told honestly, without pity standing in for reality. In April 2023, he sat across from Jane Pauley on CBS Sunday Morning and said something almost no public figure allows himself to say without flinching. "I'm not going to be 80. No performance in the delivery. No softening for the audience's comfort." He explained it the way he explains everything now, directly. "You don't die from Parkinson's," he said. "You die with it. A fall. Food going down the wrong way. Pneumonia. The quiet chain of complications that close in over time." He said he thinks about that. He said it's getting harder. Every day is tougher. So when headlines resurface every so often suggesting things are suddenly looking bad for Michael J. Fox, there's a detail worth sitting with. He said all of this himself, years ago, without anyone forcing the words out of him. He didn't wait for a network to write his ending for him. He wrote the hard parts down first, in his own voice, on his own terms. And then he went back to work. In 2020, he'd announced retirement from acting, certain the disease had taken more than it would ever give back. 5 years later, in 2025, he returned for a 3-episode arc on shrinking, playing a character living with Parkinson's, opposite Harrison Ford playing a character with the same disease. His first line to Ford carried the exact dry wit that has never once left him: "They were on the same lousy train to the same lousy destination." He later said something that reframed everything. For the first time, he could show up on set without hiding his symptoms, without performing normalcy. The disease didn't have to disappear for the work to happen. It just had to be allowed in the room. That same year, the honors kept arriving, not as farewell gestures, but as recognition of work still expanding. A Presidential Medal of Freedom. A promotion to Companion of the Order of Canada. His foundation, built from a modest goal to simply nudge research forward, has now funneled over $2.5 billion into Parkinson's research, supporting more than 175 treatment candidates currently in human trials. So when a television network briefly, mistakenly aired his obituary in April, the error wasn't in the facts. It was in the tent. It treated a man still building as a man already finished. At 65, 35 years into a diagnosis that was never supposed to allow this much life, Fox continues describing what he wants in the plainest terms he has: to keep working, keep his friendships, and enjoy his family. And then the line that holds the whole story together, delivered without any need for embellishment. "It's so much better than it could be." That, more than any headline, is the truest update on where things actually stand.